Well, I have the privilege and the burden of going last, so my head is spinning from everything today. But I'm going to try to work my way through it, despite the fact that I feel that we still don't know what we're talking about when we talk about post-internet art. I feel like nobody likes the term. No one's sure if we're even talking about art. No one's sure if it's periodized or if we're still in the middle of it. So I'm going to plow through with a group of artists who have been largely institutionalized as post-internet artists. This is in biennials and museums. So this is kind of the corpus that I've delineated. But I think one of the things that has come up throughout today is that there are so many challenges, not only to readings of these artists, but to who the artists are themselves, who is post-internet art. And I think it's kind of something that we should get through before we can think seriously about the moment. I feel like there's so much thinking about post-internet art without kind of pinning it down. So that's what I'm going to try to do by thinking historically and going backwards in time to think about why there are so few connections between post-internet art and its predecessors, especially net art and cybernetics, with which it has obvious parallels. This is just a quote from Seth Price to start off with. Okay. Oop. In 2010, Ava and Franco Mattes, the artists behind the net art project 011000101.org, created a work called No Fun, where Franco Mattes staged a suicide on the then popular site Chat Roulette. Does everyone remember Chat Roulette? Yeah, okay. When Mattes' video feed came up, this is the work here, users would see a messy room and the artist hanging from the ceiling, but obviously distanced by the internet, were unable to do anything about this or reach him in real life. The work itself is a video reel showing on the one side users' responses, so that changes throughout the video, and the static feed of the hanged Franco Mattes on the other, so he just stays there hanging. The responses are actually quite extraordinary. Most people laugh or think it is a joke, and only a few seem genuinely horrified or seek to help. It's really depressing, actually. The work itself is morally questionable, potentially horrifying people in order to make a not very clear point. And to me, it doesn't acknowledge the scale of its own shock tactics. Rather, its hyperlaconic title, No Fun, deliberately underplays the scale of both tactics and spectatorial response. But I want to talk about this work not for its merits, I'm just interested in it, but for what it says about public circulation and images, concerns that stretch across net art, cybernetics, and the contemporary field of post-internet art, all of which are united in their focuses on the interplay of technology, art, and daily life. So realized in 2010, No Fun can be seen to be at the crossroads between net art and post-internet art. Ava and Franco Mattes were active participants in the net art movement, with iconic projects such as Life Sharing, which was 2000 to 2003, where they allowed others complete access into their computer files, images, emails, Word documents, making their private lives public. They're a couple, obviously. And this at a time when Facebook and other life-documenting social media sites were non-existent. They were also behind the classically net art pranksterish gambit of Darko Maver, a Yugoslavian artist they made up, who apparently staged photographs of grisly violence. This is one of them. So you can see the same macabre tendency that they had in No Fun. They then killed them off, and the images Maver created were revealed to be actual photographs from the Yugoslavian conflict, repositioned in an art context. So you have this blurring of art and real life. Like Life Sharing, Darko Maver began online as a project that was open-ended. It was not clear how the work would resolve itself, and it ended up being more successful than I believe they imagined, as Maver was eventually invited to represent Yugoslavia at the Venice Biennale. No Fun likewise turns on the participation of internet users, but the conceit is there from the start. This is why I'm positioning it as a intermediary work. They staged a prank within a delineated time period and exhibited the result. It also pays more attention to its conditions of exhibition. This is it in the gallery Carol Fletcher, and I think they're here tonight, actually, which purposely mimics the domestic environment in which one would log on to chatroulette.com, but also in a screening setting. There's a screening setting, where it would be played within a circumscribed time period. It's an internet work, but it doesn't avail itself of code, but rather the software of the internet, an internet work for internet amateurs, to paraphrase one of Marissa Olson's definitions of post-internet art. It consists of a direct intervention via the computer into the lives of anonymous others, but resolves this in a formal exhibitory setting. So you see how it's in between the two. The Mates have been one of the few artists and artist collectives to make the transition from a net art background into a post-internet arena. And the question of why so few artists from that 1990s movement should have done so, or more broadly, why the connections between post-internet art and its apparently obvious technophile predecessors should be so blankly absent, is the ostensible subject both of this paper and of various writings online. Some of the reasons are quite explicit and have to do with positioning and intention, which makes comparing them simply because they're all focused on technology, perhaps a wrong-headed endeavor. It's not enough to say they're just all about the internet, or all about communication technologies. Net art and cybernetics were more politically engaged, and net art in particular took a more explicitly oppositional stance to the art world, which is the happy home of post-internet artists. They were both keenly interested in the possibilities of communications technology and their potential for more democratic societies and the freer flow of information. Now for post-internet artists, oh God, where did I go? What? Okay, is not something sought out. Technology is not something sought. It's like a major point too. I'll start again. Now, for post-internet artists, technology is not something sought out, but rather a constitutional element of daily life. This is something similar to what was being discussed in the panel that just came before. And the idea of information making societies more free or equitable is not at play, nor importantly is any oppositional stance towards the art world or art market. Indeed, their co-opted stance towards the art market, I'm thinking of people like Dis, is one of the most commented upon facets of post-internet art, and one of the key facets that people mistakenly mark as new. So there's a crucial difference in this positioning towards technology. But I want to change the reading of net art versus post-internet art away from this technological hinge, especially as Melanie summed it up so well yesterday. While net art and cybernetics obviously take oh, Jesus Christ. Sorry, I'm going to change my view. Oh, no, God. Sorry. Okay. Oh, while net art and cybernetics obviously take technology as their main means of focus, obviously I do not. They also seek to convene and form publics in the world at large. This is key. And often, though not quite in the public sculpture way that Seth Price talks about in the quote that I started with. There you go. But they do this within physical space. Post-internet work, rather than intervening in the world, rather seeks to reflect it, and this change is crucial, because it sheds light not only on the distinctions between these different moments, but also on how post-internet artists regard the art object, which has paradoxically become less networked in a more networked age. That is, something curious happens on the way from cybernetics to post-internet art. We find a move away from chance and openness and towards an attempt at a circumscribed public. So I want to pause here and take on board some comments that arose during the fantastic panel discussion on textures and surfaces. This is the problem of coming last. My argument in this paper is that there's a turn towards a realism of depiction, a turn towards an illustrative mode, illustration rather than intervention, which is something that Kirsten also talked about when she talked about the aestheticization of post-internet work. But what the panel brought up is that there are a number of practices that seek not only to reflect the internet, as I'm arguing, but also to use the internet to find different modes of dissemination and different modes of distribution, potentially bypassing the art market and art institutions and the many modes by which the art world polices itself. This was the kind of locus with which I started the paper, and I was trying to think of ways that we could feasibly compare these new distribution channels to the kind of interventionary modes that net artists were doing in the 1990s. But I think the problem with this, and the problem that I generated in my own research and I think has resurfaced on this last panel, on the panel one, textures and surfaces, is that we don't have any criteria for describing this second mode of distribution. You know, what Jessie Darling was talking about, she's bracketing off her Tumblr feed, her website, her discursive apparatus, her discursive output as different from our artwork. At the same time, while thinking of our artwork as something that is so at home in technology that it also uses this as a platform and a framework. And I think, this kind of dualism, even though she so persuasively asserted it, isn't actually totally resolved. I think they do feed more into one another. And I think this idea of an art object that uses different channels to distribute itself is something that David Joslet writes about in his book After Art, this idea that moving from a circumscribed art object to a network of dissemination, to a pathway or a vector. I think that's true, but I think it also remains the case that we don't have the criteria to judge these non-objects, these new vectors. So the work that I return to in writing about this not only seems almost falsely art, it becomes even more art. I mean, the work that I'm talking about even seems really conservative, returning away from modernism towards a much more 19th century realist remit. But I want to kind of, I don't know, maybe that's something we can talk about in the panel discussion, is that if it's true that we are at a state of a paradigm shift, if it's true that the internet has changed everything, I think this is going to be the locus that we are trying to describe a vector that we don't have proper terms for judging yet. Does that make sense? Yes? All right. So as I said before, the people that I chose to talk about are the ones that have more or less been ratified by the art world as this is what they mean by post-internet art. And I think that's the way we have to move forward, even though the events of today have said that there are so many other ways we could go. And I want to be a proper art historian and also look back. So let's look at cybernetics and net art in detail, and then we'll move on to post-internet art. So for net art, which I am taking as a movement that flourished online, mainly in Europe and the US in the 1990s, the relation between art projects and activism was integral to the artists' reconceptualizing of what art could be or should do. Rather than the policed academy of art institutions and its friend the market, net art projects intervened directly in the fabric of the world and took advantage of the internet to both initiate and exhibit its projects. We know this. But while the medium was generally code, many of the works were realized in the real world. And perhaps because of mutual antipathy with art institutions, instead of aiming after a gallery public, net art directly connected with what we might call a general public. So we know all this, but let's look at how it played out. Here's an image from the Barbie Liberation Campaign of 1993, when the group RT Mark, registered trademark, transferred $8,000 from a group of military veterans to switch the voice boxes in G.I. Joe dolls with those of Barbie dolls, so that when customers bought the G.I. Joe dolls, G.I. Joe soldiers, they said things like, "The beach is the place for summer." This was right after the Barbie dolls had been programmed to say math is hard, if anyone remembers that. That's great. It should have been on the Life panel. They uploaded a detailed video on how to do this onto their website so that others could accomplish the same feat. Other projects created communities by means of anonymous networks, again citing these in the physical space of the offline world. In Heath Bunting's King's Cross Phone-In, 1994, this is a great project, Bunting listed the phone numbers for various public payphones around King's Cross Station in London on a web page and designated a time for an international phone-in when people from around the world called King's Cross Station and chatted to bewildered commuters, which is a really lovely, lovely idea. This image of text on a web page is typical of the formal articulation of net art projects. You can see how anti-visual it is. It's just, it's just a screenshot of the web page and the phone numbers of the payphones. The possibilities afforded by the web and the possibility of creating new networks and publics, like the one that Heath Bunting created for King's Cross, moments of shared information and consensus, is also related to the era net art came about in, the 1990s, when it was a time of perestroika and the collapse of the Cold War, when new forms of openness were genuine notions of possibility. A number of the most important net artists were from Eastern Europe, such as Vuk Kosik and Alexei Shulgin, and for them, net art provided not only inexpensive channels of communication that had previously been unavailable, but also a chance to exercise their own beliefs in an anti-commodity approach. Cybernetics, moving on, which is rather a catch-all phrase for a number of artists and art collectives in the 1960s and 70s, who, spurred on by new technologies and their ubiquity, addressed the relations between technology and behavior. In this respect, in that they look to address the influence of technology, not just technology itself, they are perhaps closer to many post-internet projects, but they surveyed the field more systematically than post-internet art does. And more systematically, I mean almost more scientifically. Central to the project in the US, for example, was the idea that in the post-war era, technology was being used as a form of soft governance, which cybernetic experiments could sidetrack and turn to better use, chiefly through hijacking channels of communication. This was laid out by Michael Schamberg, one of the founders of Radical Software and the Raindance Foundation, in his 1971 book, Guerrilla Television, where he advocated for the decentralization of television. And cybernetic guerrilla warfare, as he called it, which itself is such an old phrase, the idea that warfare could do anything but backfire. Existing communications channels would be restructured in order to create a global village and to enfranchise those left out of the traditional corridors of power. In practice, these information-based experiments took form in drawing or sculptural machines. Feedback systems, which were a major focus of cybernetics, were constructed in order to spatially represent the flow of information back and forth. Experiments in communication also found themselves in physical form, where new communities could come together. So this is the famous image of Stan Van Der Beek's movie drones, which he developed in the 1960s, which were silo-like structures that visitors entered via trap doors. So they would go underneath and come up into it, so there's no aperture on the outside. Once inside, visitors lay on their backs looking at various films projected onto the inside of the silo, thus broadening the experience of watching a film into a full-body experience. And Van Der Beek imagined a network of these drones by which visitors could communicate to one another about what they were watching, which would create an alternative public linked through sensorial representation. There you go. Other projects were more activist and directed in their attempt to convoke new and newly empowered groups in common space. In the early 1970s, for example, the Chilean video artist Juan Downey began his Video Transamerica project. This is him in a hammock, just looking very 1970s, for which he intended to travel up and down South America, videotaping different indigenous people and showing them how to videotape themselves. Here's an example. Ultimately, he would form a public comprised of these different tribes, who would become both equipped with the means of self-representation and become aware of others like them up and down the continent. It's a really fantastic idea. A public that is formed not by those who programmed and watched TV or the public who could read newspapers, but of the indigenous groups who had been economically and politically marginalized. He began with the Yanomami, this is the Yanomami in the Amazon, but soon found that the Yanomami were not that interested in the equipment or in being captured on camera, nor in watching what had been taped. So the ultimate project moved away from this goal, this kind of utopian goal of creating one indigenous public. The ultimate project moved more towards creating a representation of the Yanomami that challenged Western representations, where they were judged by their relation to capital and economy, and obviously were found wanting. There was a number of books in ethnography and anthropology written about the Yanomami, which kind of used these yardsticks of capital and economy in France at the time to judge them by, and they were seen as inefficient and lazy because they were not working all the time. And so he tried to shift that to say that they were actually so efficient because they got by without having to work all the time. And he also was obviously trying to challenge this idea that they were primitive. They hadn't figured out yet that you have to work all the time. So this is the ultimate resolution of the Downey project. So, what's interesting at Cybernetics vis-a-vis post-internet art is, unlike net art, which kind of was online and then had its outputs often taking place in the real world, Cybernetics faced the same problem as post-internet art of initiating a project that's influenced by technology that has to resolve itself into a gallery setting, and often took quite formal and took quite conventional roots once it was inside the white box. So you can see here how he renders his image of them spatially instead of durationally, moving away from a synthetic structure of single argument and towards the reiterated or looped oral tradition of the Yanomami. And of course, physically representing the idea of the people in the space, almost by the TV monitors. And obviously this idea of a geographical territory is reiterated by the maps on the wall and on the floor. So if Cybernetic reflects the paranoia and optimism of the Cold War, and net art reflects the nascent empowering of the individual that began in the 1990s, post-internet art suggests a general depression in the current moment. The idea of broadening information in order to create a more free or just society, which is actually what hacking still believes, is plainly absent in post-internet art, which tends to be more pessimistic, cynical, or simply uninterested in the prospects of a utopian world. Indeed, post-internet work, like a grumpy uncle, tends to focus on the negative, Look at how the idea of the circulation of information is treated in Josh Klein's ironically titled Freedom. Here it is. Which reimagines a Zuccotti Park, the site of the Occupy Wall Street protests, ringed by mannequins of armored police officers with iPads in their stomach, on which people recite different found social media postings about police violence and torture. I don't think it's the most subtle work, but the point is, I think, this is my reading, is the incommensurate nature of social media platforms to the scale of the injustice committed. And I think a lot of the idea of unarmored people is also spurred on by the racial protests in the States over the past year, which really has nothing to do with Zuccotti Park. These things are just kind of conflated in his work. But more importantly, the sense of a public, so important to the Occupy Wall Street protests, is totally left out of the Klein work. Visitors engage with the individual monologues, so you can see them, they're not even looking at each other, or with the large screen video of Obama that is screened in the same space, rather than being convoked together in any meaningful way. So I'm trying to separate this from net art cybernetics. And far from information pulling people together, the obsession with surveillance shows people being pulled apart. This is an anti-drone hood made by the artist Adam Harvey that allows the wearer to remain invisible to drones. It's currently for sale at the Wexner Center for the Arts in Ohio, which is definitely where the biggest need for anti-drone technology is. So we have a difference in positioning and attitude, but as importantly, a shift in formal resolution. In his The Language of New Media, writing about the early art of the internet, Lev Manovich held that the internet lends itself to being conceived of as a database rather than something with narrative potential. However, the hallmark of database technology, that is information, is absent qua information in the work of post-internet artists. Rather, it finds itself dramatically visualized, and narrative, or more specifically allegory, visually represented, is paramount. If one of the major critiques made by post-internet art is that everything has been reduced to an image, it has also elevated the image to a sine qua non status that distinguishes it not only from net art, but also from conceptualism, institutional critique, and relational aesthetics and other reigning forms of performativity. The image, whether with high production values, glitchy, uncannily rendered, or deliberately amateurish, is the lingua franca of post-internet art. Indeed, here's a zinger, one might call this the pictures of generation, not the pictures generation. They are working in a realist idiom that is diametrically opposed to the interventionary spirit of net art. Like the turn in the 1990s away from abstraction and towards figuration, the works here suggest a mode of representation removed from the formal autonomy of classic modernism. The work is trying to create reflections of what life is like when saturated with digital technology. Thus, while net art used the internet for its project, post-internet art makes pictures of the internet. Camille Amro's film about the archive of the National Science Library in Washington, D.C., this is Gross Fatigue, 2013, is an image of the internet of its archive. So she's not going in there opening different desktop windows. She's doing a reel of pre-opened desktop windows and making a film of it. Klein's Zuccotti Park uses effectively snapshots of Facebook testimonies, illustrating the level of debate on social media rather than enabling one to occur. So what these works are trying to make is the image of the internet, the image of techniques over various invisible processes of communication and the way that we interact with them. So we have a situation that is not invested in the circulation of images, but rather in the fixing of them, rendering them into illustrations of a moment of connectivity. Rather than technology being understood as something that enables images to move freely, technology enables the artist to pull images from the web and to own them. Whether on Mark Lecky's hard drive, which was the source for his exhibition, The Universal Accessibility of Dumb Things, on the phone of someone taking a selfie in the dish shower, or for Oliver Larrick to refashion into a video that is then put up for sale. This ownership is enabled by the theoretical notion that everything has been reduced to simply infinitely iterable images, which is something that Hito Steyerl refutes, again and again in her work, and people still believe. And this reduction is an operation that post-internet art seeks to not only reflect, but also to compulsively perform. So I want to think of this idea where this context collapse, this lack of provenance, is not something that's just a given that we're existing within. It's actually something that the works compulsively repeat. They do over and over as a measure of performance within their work, but also almost like when someone knows that they don't know, they're kind of lying and they have to convince you again and again. Provenance is not only taken to be irrelevant, this is the idea of context collapse. Identity is not only taken to be a measure of styling, but these are operations that post-internet art incessantly rehearses. A constant erasing of the chalkboard that makes one skeptical about how blank that chalkboard really is. Because what's interesting about post-internet art is that just as it doesn't explicitly promote its connections to cybernetics and net art, it also doesn't explicitly ally itself with other traditions that one might think it would have come out of. Post-internet artists come out of art schools, but the strong discourse of lateral hierarchies that runs throughout the 20th century, the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, the situationist international, the simulacrum more generally, the pictures generation, pop art, appropriation, none of these surface in the work. There are a few sneaky Guy Debord nods, no Warhol winks, no post-human Cindy Shermans knocking about. Instead, some of the main discourses that artists cite are themselves young disciplines: accelerationism, speculative realism, object-oriented ontology. Speculative realism was only coined in 2007, which is a fact you learn every time you read about it. And in general, most artworks make connections among music, design, advertising, and film, a dispersion of kinds of culture in the present moment, rather than a chain of historical connections. Now, why is this? Why do we have this state of amnesia? Is this the reason? Or perhaps this is the reason. This is the idea of the immense, irrevocable, and universal paradigm shift that has been accomplished by the ubiquity of digital and communications technology. This notion of a paradigm shift has become the received wisdoms for artists, curators, and critics alike, but notably it hasn't been brought up here, I think, to our credit, and informs the much-discussed moniker post-internet art, the trend towards generational shows like Younger Than Jesus or the Serpentine's post-1989 marathon. So here is Ryan Trecarton on art and making now, in regards to the new museum triennial that he just co-curated, framing art making as a mode of behavior. This is what I mean by this, if art making is a mode of behavior, if it includes things like Tumblr posts, then we are without proper criteria to judge it by, if it does include that, as one that deliberately denies historical affiliation. Artists aren't concerned with the somewhat parochial thinking. And parochial itself is a geographic metaphor. It comes from the parish or, the area around a church, or the area under the jurisdiction of a church. So he's moving, from a public space metaphor to something, to a mode of behavior about what an art practice can or should encompass right now. It's hard to meditate on potential futures when we are still transitioning out of a period that has been culturally obsessed with defining the past through acts of rejections or fetishizations. There are many artists today who are not only looking past older entrenched ways of thinking about art, they are actually behaving past it. But so we're moving away. The previous generation was obsessed with denying the past, but we're now even denying the denial of the past. This is how amnesiatic we're meant to be. And Ken Johnson, the New York Times critic on the same show. So if you're expecting a digital show, you won't get one, or not one that advertises itself as such. For most of the participants, the majority born in the 1980s, the digital is nothing special, no big deal. It's a given, it's reality. So it's reality. Reality itself has changed. Think of what an amazingly huge idea that is to say, that you just throw it away. Reality is totally different. So what I want to show is how these so-called givens that he talks about are obsessively reworked, and actually they are taken on board by the work itself. And I think the work itself, in co-opting these claims, in promulgating these claims, is helping fuel this sense of amnesia. So for Mark Lecky's recent show, Uni Ad Dum This, which is a truncated title, a truncation of the universal accessibility of dumb objects, which premiered at Wheels and is now touring, Lecky returned to the artworks and found objects, videos, and images included in his show, The Universal Accessibility of Dumb Objects, which addressed the idea that both technology and art making endows objects with agency. For universal accessibility, he drew from a vast archive of images of things he had been collecting on his computer for many years. For Uni Ad Dum This, he rendered the universal accessibility contents as 3D copies, photographic reproductions, or 2D cardboard cutouts, thus returning the works to the images or digital information that he had initially engaged with. So here are some images of, so this is the re-rendered work. And this is a picture that I took actually of the initial exhibition in situ. So you really can't tell, except for the cardboard cutouts. It's a pretty exact likeness. Whereas appropriation works by detouring or re-signifying the original meaning of an object or image, this is a performance of severing the link to the real thing and of reconstituting it as image. He's performing the reduction to image. He's also significantly returning them to his possession. The borrowed real works go back to their owners, but he owns these remakes. They become lekkies, nouns, not possessives. Oliver Lerich is another obvious example of someone who compulsively performs this lack of provenance. In his Versions project, he represents historical images and objects by re-rendering them and either exhibiting the polyurethane casts or including them as elements in his videos, where a robotic female voice muses on them, never once identifying, however, the facts of where they come from, where they are dated. They are just images in the now, there is no before. For other artists, here are some more examples. And I mean, then the smoothed out, obviously digital quality, is meant to emphasize this irreality. For other artists, the digital creation of figures and worlds ex nihilo participates in the fantasy that there is no referent. Again, nothing came before. Ed Atkins constantly amplifies the weirdness of his digital figures to underline the fact that they exist only immaterially. Here, for example, is a gorilla performing the impossible gorilla operation of grinning wildly. His deflating head is another good example. That's the one where he has, kind of this angry man's head and then it deflates like a balloon. There's no referent, no before. Other artists picture the world as a desiccated landscape, creating a bleak, scorched earth image of primitive life, or life that's returned to a primitive state of survival. The world's so reduced that we are as animals within it. This is an image from Ian Chang, which is someone who ostensibly comments on the aesthetics of video games, while obviously participating within it. So we have two things here. First, the move to constantly create anew, and secondly, the performativity of this operation, which one can see accomplished within the scope of the work, as a transition performed rather than given. From universal accessibility to uni addum this, for example. And I think this newness also accounts for the tremendous excitement around the movement, why there are so many people talking about it, so many people writing about it, so many conferences. Think of the moniker new aesthetic, which is another term that I think has gotten a bit lost. It's a new aesthetic, not simply a return to modernism. I mean, just how many 2 or 3 documentas ago, the whole documenta was about is modernism our antiquity. I mean, we were stuck in this, privileging of the grain of 16 millimeter film. There was this, moment where we were held back, and then it was like the floodgates rushed open, and then we all went, to this novelty. But as I said before, this new is not as new as we think. This setting up shop is no different from the various other commercial projects that have been exhaustively accounted for, from Andy Warhol to Sarah Lucas and Tracy Emin to Murakami. And the reduction to image and doing away with provenance was central to postmodernism, which is only a few years away. But Crowton is right. Postmodernism was obsessed with the past, whereas post-internet work is in a state of constantly trying to inculcate the new, to be the new. So newness and unmooring from the past is constitutive of the idea itself of the work, whether or not this is accurate. And this is what feeds the sense of amnesia. It also relates to the move to own the images rather than to allow them to circulate in the real world. And I want to finish on this thought. Firstly, because the presumption of ownership is the starting point for inquiries into new forms of distribution, which is one way of separating post-internet experiments with distribution from net art invocations of public. So if we do take on board, if we do think about how if we do think of the novel forms of distribution as a part of the artwork itself, that is actually a very different thing from these kind of net art interventions. It's still getting your art out there rather than getting out there and doing something in the public at large. And secondly, to underline the extent to which post-internet arts are oriented radically inward. The reduction to image enables the artist or curator ownership in order to recreate something that has personal meaning or expresses the identity of the artist in some way. So Mark Lecky and the idea of trespassing class, Camille Henrot and an allegory of her own residency, Ed Atkins and his relationship to mortality. This is also Louise Huxtable. And this is an amazing image, I think. I don't know why, by Nikir Opara. So I've written elsewhere of the autobiographical nature of many of these works, and that of Atkins, Jim Richards, Francis Stark, and others. And again, identity appears as the strongest side of inquiry in this new moment. Who are we and how do we represent ourselves to others? So this is a romantic query and one relating to the possibilities for art and its mediation between the individual and the world. An investment, that is, in art rather than art and technology, and in the role of art, conceived of in a rather old, not new way. So what I've gotten to with the end of this idea is that this art not only operates in this illustrative, realist idiom, but it also is asking very old questions. It's saying, autobiographical questions. This is the idea of, Rimbaud sitting there and composing quasi-autobiographical poems about himself and about his relationship to the world. And there's a whole host of, almost literary questions that we have to apply to these things. To take the example of Jessie Darling again, how reliable is she as a narrator? How much can we believe what she's so performatively saying up here that, my brand new Brave New World, Brave New whatever blog is separate from my activities as an artist. So if we're thinking of the artwork as this almost 19th century phenomenon, it's a very interesting moment to think of it as so conservative or so, retrogressive at the exact moment when we're also thinking of ways we can think about the artwork as totally exploded as this, again, in this after art mode. So I think this is the kind of the bind that we find ourselves in with post-internet art, is that we don't quite know the predecessors because we might or might not be on the verge of this new paradigm shift, which feels almost too big to ratify, and we're in the middle of it. So that is, my conclusion is that we have to wait and see. Isn't that the most unsatisfying conclusion you can have? You sat here all day long, you listened to this, and we're just not sure. But I think that's kind of, if you follow if you do the due diligence, that's kind of, I think, where you end up. So I think I'll end on that and maybe take questions from the audience.
Thank you very much for that wonderful talk and for mapping this out historically, which I couldn't agree more, that I find also very, very important to get a more critical and like empowering sense of talking about all this. I have a question, which is, because you were talking about saying that, well, this is basically like a rundown modernism presenting itself as novelty, which I would formally very much agree to. I wouldn't agree with it being a realism, because I would insist that this is naturalism and not realism, because I have a soft spot for realism. But I was asking myself, in perceiving it, does one have to share the naturalism of what one is looking at, or can one rather use tools, in art history, use tools to emancipate yourself from that naturalism? For example, you can look at Atkins within the naturalism of the self-perception, but you can also look at it from medium specificity as a tool and say, well, it's more about poetry than it is about digitality, and if you look at it through this becomes far more productive than if you follow its naturalism. So I wanted to ask if you can, the historical leverage you mapped out, you can also use to bring it up against the naturalism of the present, no?
I think so. I think what's interesting about Atkins's work is that it's so rooted in kind of ratified modes of the past. He has opera, and he has these really florid monologues. And in a way, I can't think of anything less new than opera. And it's also this very, he's aiming for high art in this way that I find kind of troubling. I think, there's a class dimension there, which is something that you don't have to apply to everything, but I think does apply to his work. So I think, in that sense, there are numerous roots into his work, but I think his work presents itself on terms where it wants to be taken as high art. So in a sense, I think that's the way to look at it. But I think what you brought up in your discussion about this difference between visuality and corporality is something that I didn't really discuss here, and I've thought about it numerous times before, and I think that's, this idea that it's just image obviously ignores the fact that we, interact with everything tactilely, and we use our finger to swipe things, across the phone and yada yada yada. I mean, I think this work is reduced to image. It's this very virtuosic images that we see in the gallery, but they also do impact on us in terms of our full body experience. Ed Atkin's really, really loud opera voices are meant to create this kind of sensorial environment, just like Stan Vanderbeek was. So I think that is one way to complicate this kind of slightly maybe unfair retrogressive tendency that I'm thinking of. They are thinking of this immersion holistically. But still, I would argue that they're trying to replicate this immersion. They're illustrating, they're redoing it so that we get a feeling of the internet rather than being in the internet.
If there are no other questions at this point, I would say that we could launch the closing discussion. So if you could all please come on stage, and Melissa, if you could remain on stage, that's great.